Okay. Hi, everybody. I see that people are still joining, but let's start because we just have 1 hour. So welcome to all attendees and to our participant today. My name is Roberto Forin. I'm the acting head of MMC Europe. So in 22, two topics dominated the agenda on mixed migration dynamics in Europe. The resumption of the Western Balkan route as a major entry into Europe, and the increase of small boat crossing through the English Channel. In fact, more than 45,000 people crossed the channel to the UK in small boat, and over 144,000 attempts to cross border between the EU and the Western Balkans were recorded. That's why at NMC Europe, we decided to conduct the two studies that we'll be presenting and discussing today, which were published this week. The study was conducted through approximately 80 in-depth interviews with refugees and migrants in Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, France, and Belgium, and 70 interviews with key informants from the two regions. As I said, the two reports were published last week, and we organized this event today to quickly present the research finding from the report, and more importantly, to discuss what they are telling us about the present situation that refugees and migrants are facing in the two hotspots, but also what are the implications for policy and operational responses, and reflect on future challenges. We'll do all that with the panelists, which I'm going to be introducing later. It has to be noted that we are having this conversation in a very fast changing context. Just to mention a couple of very latest development. First, last week, in a move to cut the asylum backlog, the UK Home Office said that it will no longer differentiate between people who arrive by regular means, such as those who cross the channel, and other asylum seekers, something that has been stipulated in last year's Nationality and Border Act. Always on Thursday last week, to use the word of the newspaper Guardian, the EU agreed on a radical reform on migration asylum law to reshape for the first time in years how the continent processes and relocate asylum seekers. Still last week, in a two-day conference jointly organized by the Minister of Security of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Swedish presidency of the Council of the European Union, and facilitated by IOM, an action plan for sustainable migration governance in the Western Balkans for 23 to 25 was approved. All this to say that it seems to me that the conversation that we are having today is an important one, and one therefore I'm very much looking forward to. So before giving the floor to my colleague Jane for the presentation of the research finding, I would of course like to thank the donor who made this research possible, namely the UK government, Conflict Stability and Security Fund, the Swiss Foreign Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Robert Bosch Foundation. With this, I'll give the floor to Jane for the presentation of the research finding. In the chat, I think that colleague Fiona shared some sort of house rule. To make it short, question answer, please ask them in the opposite question answer box. We'll take answer question from the chat, from the question answer box, and then try to answer those at the end of the panel discussion. Yeah, and I think with this I can give the floor to Jane. Jane?
Yes, great. Thanks very much, Roberto. So I'm Jane Linekar. I'm head of research and forum at the Mixed Migration Center, and I'm here to give you some points and some of the findings from the two studies that have just been published. In the time we've got, I can't do justice to everything, but hopefully it will pique your interest and inspire you to go back and read those publications. And also, I think key points are going to be picked up during the discussion later. Fiona, if we can move to the next slide, please. Great. So the aims of these reports, a little bit as Roberto introduced, but we're in an environment of harder borders, poor reception facilities and securitization of the borders, we were looking to consider the mixed migration dynamics in two areas at the external borders of the EU, to understand who's moving, how, where they're moving, and what the risks are for their movement. We took very much a focus on migrants seeking or intending to seek asylum in the EU and the UK. And in these studies, we haven't included Ukrainians, but much more people who are traveling on irregular pathways. Next slide. So jumping straight in and starting with the study on the Western Balkans. First to start with, this was written by Paul Kluet. So thanks to him. And thanks to everyone who participated in the preparation of the report, not least the interviewees and the facilitators of the field research. A quick overview of the methodology. Paul conducted a desk review, 28 key informant interviews with NGOs, UN agencies, government and media, as well as 26 individual and group interviews with 49 refugees and migrants in Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Greece, in Austria, and in Belgium. The sample of refugees and migrants was very much, for the most part, made up of men, 47 men, 2 women. 45 of interviewees were aged 20 to 39 and made up of 10 nationalities. A lot of Afghans among the sample, quite a few from Morocco, and the other nationalities were fewer in number. As with all research, there are limitations to what we've done. There's clearly limitations in the scope of what we can examine, but hopefully we have a strong overview of the mixed migration dynamics. The research was done at a particular time of year, at a particular time itself, which influences the results that we have. And also it's very much dependent on access to refugees and migrants and the willingness of those respondents to share information. So things to bear in mind when we're talking about the findings. Next slide, please. So the Western Balkans, here you can see the red points indicating where we conducted interviews and research, and then the key focus countries of the study are in orange. The Western Balkans is clearly a key strategic region for the EU and for migration. As Roberto indicated, 2022 saw a peak in detections of irregular entry to the EU from the Western Balkans since 2015. And this is despite a strong focus on securitization and deterrence since then. So we wanted to look a little bit at what was happening. Next slide, please. So who is taking the Western? From the research that we've done, we found it's mainly made up of Syrians and Afghans, followed by a large group of Moroccans. In much lower numbers, we see Iranians, Pakistanis, and Iraqis on this route. But the numbers and the nationality composition varies relatively rapidly. And perhaps this could be related, as we observed potentially for Pakistanis, to policies and the actions of states, where we saw a movement of Pakistanis using the Western Balkan route, then moving back to using the Central Mediterranean route more frequently. It's mostly men that are found on the journey, but that doesn't mean that women and children are not taking the Western Balkan route. There's an estimate that women and children each make up about 10% of people on that route, which is not many, but there's still an important number and still require very specific response and individual attention as groups. Next slide, please. Quite a number are taking onward movement from an initial country of refuge, for example, Turkey. This is often because they've encountered discrimination, abuse, threat of return, the inability to make a living in that initial destination, and really having no durable solution in sight for them in place. Intentions vary a lot, generally people aiming to reach Western Europe. 3 of the people we interviewed had actually already been in the EU and worked as irregular migrants before deportation, and they intended to do the same again. The intended destination seems to be determined a lot by social networks and having compatriots in the country of intended destination, and the prospects of actually being able to stay and being able to work, as well as anticipated support, or at least the potential to have decent living conditions. There's a strong role of family reunification in the kind of movements that we're seeing, with people joining others who have already made the journey, or taking the journey as the first individuals from a family or household and expecting others to join them later. Most often, these movements are led by men and in some cases, boys. So that's a little bit of an overview of who is on the route and the kind of movements, but what is the Western Balkan route? The Western Balkans is very much a transit space from everything that we saw. Less than 4% of people who intend to claim asylum do it in the Western Balkans. Asylum claims are not often very successful here. And it was also not perceived as a measure of success to be settling in the Western Balkans. Even minors who are afforded protection in Serbia, for example, tend to move onwards. The detail of the routes through the Western Balkan region shift. This can be according to season, according to weather conditions, but also according to policy and knowledge about security operations. Nationality groups tend to take particular routes. And we did observe something with people talking about only getting to Greece, because of Greece being not favoured, because there remain multiple countries still to cross before reaching the heart of Europe. In comparison, Bulgaria is considered a more direct and cheaper route, but much more arduous. When we look at the information that people have on routes and destinations across the Western Balkans and further into Europe, it's much more often incomplete than wrong information. So people will be aware of the principles of the Dublin process, but they're not aware of exactly how it is implemented, and they're not less aware of the details of asylum processes in particular countries. Access to information is generally through social networks, via social media, but mostly with friends and family. Having a smartphone and a connection to a smartphone is extremely important to be able to do this. Next. One recent change on the route that's particularly noteworthy is the speed of movement through the region, which has accelerated. Reception centres are seeing a similar number of people to what they've seen in the past, but the stays are much shorter. This may be partly due to the effect of Croatia's slight relaxation of what had been a very hard pushback regime. So more people have got to Croatia and beyond, and people are less stuck. It's also attributed to more organised or expert smuggling journeys. Next slide, please. When we move to looking at some of the risks on the route, securitization has increased and humanitarian response has decreased, and it looks like it's continuing that way into 2023. This for years, and the EU support to the Western Balkans is covering the strengthening of border protection, fighting smuggling, stepping up returns, and greater alignment of visa policy. There are more police at the borders, and there's a presence at the borders. This increased securitization has resulted in violence by state authorities at borders. The use of pushbacks as a de facto tool of border management historically in Croatia, and excessive force is frequent during detention and expulsion pushbacks. This can be physical abuse in terms of actual violence, but also in terms of denial of food and water. There is harassment, reports of extortion, and destruction and theft of property, and denial of access to seek asylum. We found reports of sexual violence and abuse of women and girls and of boys. And the conditions of the journeys are also presenting their own dangers. Scabies, as reported, due to the conditions of travel and living, and the impact of the cold. In some places, there's unexploded ordnance, which is a risk for people on the move. And this is all impacting on people's mental health. Next slide, please. So increased securitization has resulted in increased dependence on smugglers, which I mentioned briefly just before, and increased organization of smuggling journeys. We observed that there are multi-country packages which seem to be more common, promising crossings of more than one country, and these are paid at origin or in installments along the journey. There is still the odd one-off deal for part of the journey, but we saw that some people are paying up to 11,000 to travel, for example, from Afghanistan to Europe. Smugglers are often from the same nationality and language group, but there are also smugglers from the Western Balkan region. There's not much in the way of reporting of violence of smugglers towards clients, in contrast, for example, to earlier in the route, e.g. at the Iran-Turkey border. But smugglers on the Western Balkan route tend to be considered more as business people who are providing promised services. Also, there's an important role of bribery and police corruption in facilitating the smuggling of people across borders. In fact, it's hard to travel without smugglers, it seems, and especially for some of the more vulnerable groups, including families, which is a clear concern. Increased securitization seems to be proving more of an inconvenience or an obstacle, a temporary setback rather than an effective measure, halting irregular journeys. People are still trying to transit the Western Balkans. They're still taking quite big risks to do it, and they're still reaching the EU. I'm going to move now to France and Belgium. Next slide, please. So this report was written by Mira Gratier and Praxis Labs. And so thanks very much to her. I think she's online in case there's any tricky questions about the field research, as well as participants and the facilitators during my acknowledgements to them. The methodology for this report was very similar, this time 29 in-depth interviews with refugees and migrants, again, mostly men, 28 men and 1 woman, and 8 nationalities. The data collection took place in 4 locations. We spoke to Iraqis, Afghans, Sudanese, mostly, but 5 more nationalities as well. Same sort of limitations as I mentioned before. Next slide, please. So there's long been mixed movement to France and Belgium and onward to the UK. What's relatively new is the small boat crossings issue and the new challenge of Brexit and the new EU border area. So looking again and trying to pick up similar points to what we did for the previous study. Next slide, please. The profiles are, again, mostly men and often very young. 6 of the people that we spoke to had started their journey before they were 18. There are, again, also women and young children traveling on this route. They're fewer in number and often overlooked, similar to the Western Balkan situation. And again, it's a shifting population in terms of nationality. People are moving in search of protection and in search of livelihoods. We saw onward movement also found similar to what we saw in Western Balkans, but also Eritreans leaving Sudan, South Sudan, and Uganda, and others who've moved on from other EU countries where their subsidiary protection was exhausted. So it's clearly a question of lack of durable solutions and fear of return. The journeys to reach France and Belgium are complex and often very fragmented, many cases very arduous and traumatic journeys. Most of the people that we spoke to referred to using a smuggler for at least parts of the journey, and most had taken either the central Mediterranean route, encountering most of the dangers in Libya, or the Western Balkan route, reporting that the dangers were the most at the borders in the Balkans. Key factors for their destination intentions are around access to work and income, around social networks, and around knowledge of a language. So again, we're seeing a similar pattern, a strong role of family, pressure from family to get to a certain destination, people from back home who've organized the journey, but also wanting to reunite with family members at a specific destination in Europe. Many had not initially considered their destination in great detail. Energy is very much taken up on reaching Europe and the EU. So France or Belgium or even the UK was not necessarily the initial place that they wanted to go to. But however, many were seeking to stay in France and Belgium, and some were thinking about the UK. 21 people that we spoke to talked in detail about the decision making, and only 3 of those had initially aimed to settle in France and Belgium. By the time we conducted interviews with them, 16 were applying or considering applying for asylum. So we can see how decision making changes along the journey. 5 sought to reach the UK and 6 were thinking about it. 2 had already been to the UK and returned. Reasons for trying to reach the UK were an expectation of easier access to asylum, but in particular being able to work sooner and faster. And also less likely to be harassed by authorities, partly related to not having to have ID. So what kind of mixed migration space is it in France and Belgium? Next slide, please. So people in northern France and Belgium can really be considered as stuck in transit. They're feeling that they have nowhere else left to go, but they're still very much moving within this region. These are interconnected hubs. So there's a lot of movement within place because people don't have a fixed place to stay. They're stuck mainly due to their status and the complexity and unpredictability of asylum processes, where people are waiting for decisions, are uncertain about what decision to take because they don't know the implications of the decision making. The Dublin procedure plays a central role in this. There's a fear of Dublin because it's very hard to predict, a fear that it will force refugees and migrants to live somewhere where they don't want to be, when they either had good reasons for choosing a destination, often due to family links, or for avoiding the first country of arrival through fear of being returned or fear of not being able to access livelihoods. Some actually mention Dublin as a driver for reaching the UK where it doesn't apply. Like in the Western Balkans, access to information is problematic because it is incomplete and often inaccurate. Few of the people we spoke to were doing their own research or accessing legal services. Instead, they turned to personal networks which were more trusted. Again, there's a strong dependence on access to phones among the population. Next slide, please. So looking at risks in this part or in this region, again, securitization is increasing and the humanitarian response is less strong. Conditions are deliberately poor. The French policy of no fixation points means that people must be constantly moving. Facilities are scarce in both countries. Accommodation is a big problem, as is sanitation. Refugees and migrants are enduring poor physical health more because of these poor conditions, scabies, diphtheria, and chronic issues due to perhaps more acute initial issues due to lack of access to health services. But there's also police harassment was talked about a lot, as well as evictions. The police are avoided, and there were some mentions, there's some reports of violent abuse by police on the beaches. People were talking about a siege mentality. So mental health, which may have been impacted by trauma in the country of origin, the trauma of the journey, and then the trauma on top of that of the uncertainty of conditions and the poor conditions in France and Belgium. Again, returning to youth and women who are often overlooked and not getting assistance. In order to get the assistance they need to be identified, but often they prefer not to be identified, thinking it keeps them safer. There's a fear of detention, a fear of being isolated, a fear of abuse from those offering assistance, and a fear of not being able to reach their migration goals. This is a key concern. The increase in securitization has led to increased risks on the journey to the UK. 364 deaths have been recorded in this region for refugees and migrants since 1999, and we expect this to increase as securitization increases. The smuggling dynamics seem quite separate here from in the rest of Europe, but smugglers play very different roles. So some are seen much more as facilitators of movement and others much more as businessmen trying to make money. There's little contact between the refugees, migrants, and the smugglers. And the risks lie far more with refugees, and migrants and smugglers stay out of physical contact. Again, it seems that increased securitization is perceived by the refugee and migrant as just one more obstacle. So despite all of those obstacles, these are considered minor compared to what many have been through already to get to this point. They've come so far, they're not turning back. And there seems to be a greater fear of returning than of the challenges of staying or moving onward. Final slide, please. So yeah, the mental pressures are really emphasized here, and it is to do with this uncertainty and difficulties with decision making and the fear of return. Next slide. So finishing off with just some thoughts on what next. I've taken some quotes from existing studies which very much relate to the France-Belgium report, but are also worth thinking about in terms of some of the challenges in the Western Balkans. In addition to this, we have a problem with information. It's difficult for researchers, policymakers, etc., to access reliable information. on the number of people moving and the number of people in need and the kinds of needs that they have. But it's also migrants and refugees to access reliable and accurate information. So there are some big gaps there, which makes it very hard to address needs. Then there's a question about what is happening to the people who are getting stuck due to securitization, because they aren't leaving and they need assistance and their needs will grow. Finally, it seems that Dublin isn't working. In some cases, people are actually moving more, and the time it's taking to process the regulation is proving very difficult in terms of this increase in needs and people being stuck. With that, I hope that's given a relatively fair reflection of the findings of the report, and I encourage you to read them, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. This was not an easy task to squeeze the two reports into 20 minutes presentation. Thank you very much. So now we are moving to the next part of the launch, not yet the post-event survey, which is the panel discussion. We have with us 4 panelists. 2 are going to focus predominantly on the France and Belgium case study, and the other 2 on Western Balkans, but they are free to also say whatever they think they can contribute to the discussion for the other regions. So we have Julien Lejeune, the director of NANSEN, which is a center of legal expertise on international protection based in Belgium. We have Julien Buha Collette, who is operational team leader, regional support team Europe for Médecins, Frontières. We have Sasa Kecman, who is director of the Center for Security and Migration Dialogues and former advisor to the Minister of Security in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And last but not least, we have Sibylle Aebi, who is head of program in Bosnia and Herzegovina for the Danish Refugee Council. So each panelist will give a 5 minutes intervention based on questions that are going to ask them. And then we still have 10 minutes for question and answer. So please do not hesitate to put your question in the question and answer, because we are going to address them after the end of the 4 interventions. So let's start with Julien Lejeune. As Jane just said in the presentation and also in the last slide, in the France-Belgium report, we argue that the complexity and unpredictability of asylum procedure are impacting on access to protection and conditions for refugees and migrants in irregular status. And also that somehow refugees and migrants are trying or considering to crossing to the queue to the UK because they felt that reaching Britain is a way to escape Dublin, if you like. So can you elaborate on this point based on your experience in Belgium?
Thank you, Roberto, and the whole team for having me. I will make 3 brief remarks on the content of the research report and address your question to confirm this finding, indeed, that the complexity and the unpredictability of the procedures actually impact, in particular, the vulnerable asylum applicants. We assist around 150 asylum applicants annually, yearly, and we mostly support applicants in a vulnerable position or facing an intersection of multiple vulnerabilities. And we assist them over the course of multiple applications. And I must say that over the course of the last 5 years, we have supported a lot of individuals and a lot of vulnerable of them who in the end got granted international protection. So based on our observation, we may state that there is a relatively global failure of the system to efficiently detect the vulnerabilities and then to give them at all stages of the international protection procedure proper consideration. So I mean by this, allowing the detection of these the detection of these vulnerabilities to impact on the next steps of the procedure. Now, to put into perspective the findings of the study with today's situation in Belgium, I'll just stress two facts quickly. First, that there is a decrease in absolute and relative numbers of arrests and detention of transit migrants. So we speak of a 90% decrease in arrests between 2018 and 2022. And I spoke about this with Myriam this week, and what they state is that this shift, this impressive statistics also corresponds to a shift from the individual migrants being the target, the main target of the law enforcement system, to a shift in the policies conducted at the state level, who explain also this situation. Secondly, I want to highlight a significant change in the group of nationals registered as transit migrants in Belgium based on these police arrests, with the appearance in the last years, in 2022 in particular, of less protection-related nationalities, and I'm speaking of Vietnam and Tunisia. While back in 2018, there were mainly indeed Eritreans, Sudanese, and Iraqis. And now at the very final reflections, looking towards the future, at Belgian level, just to make a link between something that Jane put forward, that is the dire reception conditions, and the fact that there is a large group of migrants and asylum seekers living on the streets in Brussels since more than a year and a half. And that this, of course, also impacts and diminishes the ability of these individuals to enjoy the full of their rights in the procedure, which is as such already a bit insufficient in taking into account vulnerability. So we are worried about this. And a very final word to say that I would like to share with you here today, one of the findings of a larger project on vulnerable migrants and asylum seekers in Europe, Vulner project, highlighting that the lived experience of asylum seekers under the current EU asylum policy is actually characterized by a feeling of being passive bystanders. We are speaking of people who became involuntarily mobile and then are stopped and constrained to immobility. So just to say that involuntarily imposed waiting is undermining anyone's agency, and that I believe that any system characterized by this feature is and will remain challenged by individuals claiming control on their own destinies and escaping from the system, so trying to remain mobile. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, also for being impressively precise with the timing. Thank you. Now we move to Julien. So as we said in the report, as Jane mentioned in the presentation, it was also now also affirmed by Julie, we have noted a serious concern when it comes to refugees and migrant living conditions that are far below minimum standard. This combined with regular eviction leads to physical and mental health impact. This is also linked to what Julie just said about an increased number of people seemingly stuck, involuntarily mobile, something you and I have discussed. So can you tell us something about the situation as you witness it in your work? And then it would be also interesting to hear something from you about how you see the situation evolving in light of the UK-France continued cooperation and a continued push in UK toward deterrence, and potentially also the announced reform that I mentioned in the intro of the EU asylum law. that is currently being discussed. So are those elements going to make a difference? What is going to be their impact on the situation as it is? Julien, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation. Just as a starting point, I just would like to say that Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, is involved in migration for decades. And right now, we've got 4 operational centers that are involved in operation in European territory or at the immediate border of Europe. So we are present in Italy, in Greece, in Serbia, in Poland, in Belgium, and as well in France, and together with the search and rescue operation in Central Mediterranean, and as well operation in Libya. So basically what we have is a kind of overall and quite comprehensive approach of the migration journey and the different steps that the people are going through. And that's really our operational intention. What we are seeing right now, it's basically, and it's a quite a worrying trend that we are looking at for the past few years, is a normalization of violence through these restrictive policies that are put in place and that have a devastating impact on the health of the people. And this violence is basically, or direct or indirect, is permanently present all along the steps of the journey. So what do we see right now in Europe, just in terms of the update on the movements that we are looking at, knowing that right now the focus is really on this triangle between UK, France, and Belgium, but that there are other routes as well. Towards Germany and the rest that as well. Should be of interest. But basically, what we are looking at right now, just as a point, is that in France, people in Calais and Grande-Sainte in particular are moving very fast to UK, and we are looking at even in the past few days we've got an increase of arrival through the channels, but they are not Sainte and Calais. They are moving very fast, and that is due as well to the pressure that is put in these areas by the authorities. As well, related to that, what we are looking is that Belgium and the movement from Belgium, especially from the parking situation to go in trucks in UK, is still ongoing, and that's a trend that we've seen for the past few years. One thing that has been mentioned, from everybody, is actually these people stuck in transit or in very vulnerable situation. It means that it's not just about movement; it's as well about the immobility of the people. And I think that's quite important as well with the trends of the new policies established. But you were mentioning the asylum seekers that found themselves, in a situation which is quite incredible, because they submit their asylum request, but do not have access to the services that should be provided to them as an obligation by the states. And right now we are talking about 3,171 people that are living in the streets for the past few months because they do not have access to accommodation. There is a last point when it comes to the movements. It's as well the people, what we say, the people en errance, which are moving from one country to the others without really any kind of standing point anywhere. In Brussels, that was specifically associated to the community of unaccompanied minors, which was very characterized by a problem of drug addiction and as well heavy violence. So that's the frame. What do we see from a health perspective? All these population that we're talking about have very limited access to basic services, accommodation, health, legal support, information, as you were mentioning. And that has a direct impact. Why? Because the services are saturated, and somehow as well because it's complex for the people to actually access these basic services. And I'm mentioning health. At the same time, these people have been going through very strong trauma along the journey, and as well in the place where they are arriving. And right now, just in terms of figures, let's say that the mental health issue is a very important part of what we are dealing with as Doctors Without Borders. And just to give you an idea, but it's very much and very often related to the violence along the journey. In 2021, MSF France had interviews with their patients in their programs, and around 70% actually said that they were subject to violence along the journey as well. And we've been denouncing this for years, but more recently in Ventimiglia, on the border between France and Italy, there were pushbacks, including of minors, that were reported. We know as well about the New York Times article that reported on an alleged pushback in Lesbos, where our teams are actually present. And MSF as well denounced the use of containers to actually lock down people at the Hungarian-Serbian border. So violence is, present all along the way. And this has an impact on the mental health and the physical health. For example, what we are treating right now, especially when it comes to mental health. Yes.
If I can ask you to try to wrap up.
I will go fast. You see, 5 minutes. No, that's you set up the standard, Julie. I'm sorry, but so what I just want to say, yes, in terms of mental health, anxiety, depression, PTSD, that's definitely something that we're looking at. But as well, pathologies related to the living conditions, and we are talking about basic wounds, respiratory infections, but as well skin disease, scabies is absolutely omnipresent in the squats, and digestive issue as well that we are treating, and all that. This is really the impact of the policies that we are looking at right now. And just one last bit, but on the migration pact, I think what is important is that it's confirming more or less the trends that we are seeing, and really with a focus at the entry point border, with and I think that there is a kind of it's a kind of system to try to avoid secondary movement into European territory, but it will not prevent the secondary movement. It will make them more dangerous, more difficult, and more hazardous. And that's definitely, we know that it will result as well in potentially more vulnerabilities, more violence, and more despair and tragedies, as we've seen, and that has been reported in the documents you published. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julien. Thank you. Yeah, I'll not add a reflection. Let's continue because we're running a bit late, 5 minutes late. Panelists that will be focusing on the Western Balkan report. So I'll start with Sasa. So beside the number I mentioned at the beginning, back in 22, there were fears that the situation at the eastern border was getting somehow out of hand. A lot of measures were put in place, from increased presence of Frontex in the region, the end of visa-free regime for a number of nationalities in Serbia, the adoption in December 22 of the new action plan for the Western Balkans, which was then also discussed last week, as I mentioned. All these measures we were wondering whether these measures were effective or not in reducing transit. This is the sense that one gets because the situation in the region is not making news anymore, at least not as it was happening last year. But when we look at numbers, I've been looking at IOM reports. They reported that almost 35,000 arrivals by the end of April, which is basically the same in 22. So what's your analysis of the situation, and what's your expectation for the development over summer, which we know is a particularly important period in the region? Sasha.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's actually hard for me to speak from this civilian perspective now, as I spent several years working as an advisor to the minister, actually directly in charge of migration and asylum for the Ministry of Security of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to the extent where if there is no cooperation between the countries in Western Balkans, we're at the mute point. If there's no agreement, full agreement within EU on the pact, on the countries that are not supporting what the general EU leadership is thinking, then we are getting to the same position where we were 2015-16. The only reason why we are seeing this in a different light is because the transit is much faster. The routes are now expanding, the smugglers are now taking new courses, and it's putting us in perspective that this will not stop. It will increase during the summer, especially having in mind that summer is when you have more movement. Croatia is now more on, it's more penetrable than it was in the past. A lot of times we mentioned pushbacks. A lot of times, I mean, we have to understand, and I was directly involved in all these aspects, is that from the government side, you have to protect your border. Of course, legal migration, illegal migration, what the EU wants, how many people should be accepted, asylum procedures, it's all talks that we have for many, many years. And to be honest, many meetings and many conferences and roundtables were held in the past years. Just what you just mentioned, recent one in Sarajevo that was hosted by the Ministry of Security and co-hosted by the IAM. It's just my personal view was we talk about it, we meet at the conferences, and then nothing happens in between. We do not operational make plans that we action plans or anything that we put together and agree on and adopt. We don't actually put it in operational use, and then that's the problem. I mean, in general, these numbers will continue to rise. Issue is, how do we protect people that are on the move? We see this from humanitarian perspective. I was seeing this from the government perspective as well, but it's never the same story. You have different views and different opinions. So in order to have this, we need to push more together in joint efforts that when I was part of the ministry, was pushing for if we want to make this work. Otherwise, smugglers will be more intelligent than us. They have techniques that will avoid cameras, drones, security systems that we have at the borders. I mean, we did increase a lot of stuff. We did put a lot of effort in making things more harder to reach, but it's not going in the right direction. So if we don't do something concrete, we will have the crisis that we are not calling crisis right now, because the transit is just faster, but the numbers are there, and I hope that nobody dies along the route. So I'll keep it at that. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Yeah, I might get back to you a bit later. You say more concrete measures should be put in place, so we might want to hear more about what those concrete measures could be. But before that, let us move to the last panelist, Sibylle from DRC. So we have been hearing from colleagues discussing the situation in France and Belgium about mental health issues, condition substandard, and then we also hear speaking about pushback and violence. And of course, it's something that came out quite strongly also for the report for the Western Balkans. Sometimes also linked to a sort of prolonged stay in the region for people that they have other destination. Now we are hearing from Sasha that it seems that transit is becoming faster. So in short, can you tell us a little bit what's the situation as you are seeing it in the ground as we speak? And then also in your case, how you see the situation evolving over summer, both in terms of the kind of needs that refugees and migrants will have and the scale of those needs.
Of course, thank you very much first off for the invitation to participate in today's panel. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I wanted to focus on some areas that you also mentioned in your questions, which are not covered in too much detail in the report. But briefly for context, I wanted to start off with a few words on DRC's current program priorities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which continue to be health and protection as the core sectors of our mixed migration response. We operate in all 4 official temporary reception centers, where we provide protection services, access to primary and secondary healthcare, as well as access to mental health and psychosocial support through our partner Médecins. Outside of formal reception centers, we see a continued need to have mobile protection and health teams, which operate close to border crossings and in remote areas to ensure that people on the move who are stranded in squats and in particular victims of pushbacks have access to immediate first aid and psychosocial support, as well as access to referrals for services and accommodation available in temporary reception centres should they opt for taking advantage of that. In addition, and this is something I really would like to stress, we also deploy a large number of cultural mediators whose role remains absolutely crucial in ensuring that our health and protection services, as well as services of other organizations, can be accessed in a meaningful way by people on the move. As you were asking about the current situation on the ground, it is still very much in line with the content and the conclusions of the report that was presented earlier. The main protection risks faced by people on the move continue to be exposure to violence and abuse, rights violations, including pushbacks at the border with Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, thefts and destruction of property and exploitation, which again has been very well documented in the report, and which unfortunately have not materially changed since numbers we had last year. In terms of health needs, the prevalence of communicable diseases remains. This is basically mirroring what Julien was saying about the situation in Belgium. 60%, over 60% of health services provided by us are related to treatment of infectious diseases, mainly respiratory, skin, in particular scabies, and digestive conditions. Also, and perhaps even more worryingly, we are seeing many traumatic injuries due to falls from bridges, hazardous river crossings, etc., which unfortunately have resulted in drownings during the past summer, or serious injuries, which besides obviously the long-term health consequences for the individual, also require longer treatment, longer recovery, continuous nursing care, which puts additional pressure on healthcare services in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Generally speaking, people who have been on the move for prolonged periods, traveling overland and often on foot, as opposed to these nationalities that were mentioned that arrive directly at Sarajevo airport by plane or neighboring Belgrade, present with poor overall health conditions. Again, as Julien mentioned as well, due to lack of hygiene along the route and lack of access to medical assistance. Apart from general health concerns, and I hope I still have time for this, I would also like to highlight the importance of addressing mental health needs. This year, again, to mirror what Julien said, besides anxiety and depression, which are widespread among this population, we are also seeing an increase in psychiatric consultations and higher numbers of arrivals with often severe mental health conditions and diagnoses of mental and behavioral issues, which again require a comprehensive case management approach, longer term and more intensive care. As the report has highlighted and Mr. Kecman mentioned as well, the high turnover and short average days is a trend that continues up to now, and which has led to a higher workload for all service providers operating inside and outside of temporary reception centres. And this is despite the overall lower average occupancy rates that we are seeing in camps. This is exacerbated by the fact that humanitarian funding continues to shrink, and many organizations, as a result, are reducing their field presence. For reference, IOM recorded over 20,000 arrivals to the camps since the start of the year, which is a considerable number. Looking ahead again towards late summer and autumn, we once again expect higher numbers of arrivals. This is mainly based on trends observed in past years, where starting in August through September, October, we see as the peak months in terms of influx. Now, from an operational perspective, in case we do see higher numbers of arrivals or even continue with current dynamics, but continued reduction in funding, we are concerned that basic needs, including health and in particular mental health protection, along with food and NFI that is available in the camps, will not be sufficient to adequately cover the needs of all the people in need. And unfortunately, we don't see this necessarily changing, as the priorities that you mentioned from the action plan for sustainable migration governance in the Western Balkans tends to highlight strengthening border management and controls, facilitating effective returns to countries of origin, and combating smuggling of migrants and trafficking in human beings, which are obviously also worthwhile pursuits when it comes to a protection perspective, but which could leave gaps for the coverage of basic needs for people on the move, which are still very much present in Bosnia. Thank you. I hope I did much.
Thanks, Sibylle. We have a couple of minutes left. So as mentioned, I'd like perhaps to go back to Sasha, but I'll ask you to be even briefer than before, because if you manage to answer in 1 minute, we might still ask the same question to other panelists. So if you have one suggestion for a concrete measure that will make an impact, that be explained and ask in 1 minute what that will be.
But what we said, the problem here is the hypocrisy of Europe as well. Once you start improving measures at the borders and strengthening borders and return procedures and putting money into that, and then shrinking the humanitarian response, it kind of conflicts each other. I mean, it makes no sense. So in order to be on, the actions plan are great, but if they're not used in a operational and in practical ways, then there's no point. We just write a plan and we say, yeah, we have a plan, and then nothing happens. That's the unfortunate thing of this. Legalizing migration would be something that would all the countries should work. I mean, if you look at it, I'm trying to be brief, 600,000 that Germany just recently said they need when it comes to workforce. I mean, Europe is getting older. Of course, everybody would like to get all the brains from Eastern Europe with diplomas, with degrees, and everything else, and very hard to get people that are coming all across the world. So the level of agreement at the EU level must be reached. So it's either humanitarian, economical, or it's we stop everybody at the border, we increase Frontex, we do all of this. It cannot be both. So I have many measures and plans that I predicted for us, but I left the ministry. So hopefully the new minister and ministry will continue on that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm coming from security background, asking for more humanitarian and legal pathways. That's somehow refreshing. So we are running out of time, but so it's 3. I'm tempted to close it here, perhaps, just because I don't want to be disrespectful toward those that they probably committed to something else at 3, as happened during working days. And I would like to thank all panelists for, I see a question, but perhaps we can do that. I'd like to thank those that have to leave, but then I perhaps still take a question and go over 5 minutes, just because it would be rude not to answer. So I'm reading the question as we speak because we just received it. At the end of the pandemic and the refinement of smuggler tactics show increase in the risk behavior used by smugglers during the pandemic. Okay, so if the measure adopted by smugglers during the pandemic, where the border control were more stringent, have been having an impact on the capacity for them to have migrant crossing the border. I think that this is a question, I don't want to have the same panelists again, but this is clearly a question for you, Sasha. So if you want to try to answer concisely.
Yes, I mean, there's a huge increase. You mentioned the same origin groups. There's so many different task forces at the level of Europe that are trying to put this to the end. Unfortunately, people die in vehicles, people die in the woods, people die in the rivers. I mean, it's very, very hard to put a stop to that. And I personally think we should advocate this through international organizations such as IAM and others that are present everywhere in the world, even in countries of origin, that, you know, how, and I know they do it, but to a certain extent, how dangerous this trip is, and how should we kind of focus more on encouraging legal migration instead of illegal migration. And the unfortunate thing, I've been everywhere. When I was with the ministry, we traveled through the complete Western Balkan. We started routes that all the migrants start, and we went on that path. Yes, with the bus, not on the foot. But in general, we've seen everything, and we've been in Greece, we've been in Turkey. I mean, this, if it's not, again, going back to what I was saying earlier in my my presentation, that if we don't join forces, none of this will stop, and people will continue to go, and people will continue to be on the move, and unfortunately die, and children will be exposed, and many things will be, you know, just going back to the same old, yes, we meet today to meet again in 3 months. Oh, hi, how are you? And nothing happened. Sorry for the being blunt.
Yeah. Thank you. So I see
Thank
that
you.
people are leaving. So I think I'll close it here. I'd like to thank you, all the panelists, for their presentation. We are going to share the recording for those that their interest. And then you can always write us to Mixed Migration if you want to hear more, or perhaps to be put in touch with the panelists for continuing the conversation. So thank you very much all. And then I wish you a very nice afternoon and evening.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.